She was Hannah Montana. Then she was the girl swinging on a wrecking ball. Then she was the rebellious performer who broke the world at the VMAs. And then later, the woman who lost her entire home in a fire and started from nothing again. In 33 years, Miley Cyrus has lived more life than most people get in a lifetime. She's been loved, hated, celebrated, and criticized. Sometimes all at the same time. America's sweetheart and America's controversy. But here's the question. Through every single transformation, every headline, every reinvention, she never apologized for being her. Until now. Because today, in the View studio, sitting across from Sunny Hostin, something entirely unexpected was about to unfold. It wasn't going to be questions about her past. It wasn't going to be talk about her growing up, her scandals. No, this was going to be something different, something deeper. And for the first time, the woman who never backed down was about to face a challenge that would test her, the way she thought she had been tested before. What happens when a butterfly is finally pinned to the wall? Stick with me, because this next story might forever change the way you see Miley Cyrus. The View studio. Over the years, countless celebrities have sat at this desk, but every time Miley walked in, you knew there was something in the air, a different kind of energy, a kind of knowing that literally anything could happen, and most of the time, it did. By 33 years old, Miley was in what critics are calling her mature era. She had won Grammys for Flowers, silencing the doubt that for so long had been hurled at her as just another Disney Channel girl. But had she ever really been just another Disney Channel girl? Stripped of spectacle, her voice was finally enough. Strong, powerful, and enough to stand shoulder to shoulder with any artist out there. She had managed the impossible. She had earned respect. As she walked out onto the studio floor, her signature husky voice was the first thing we heard. It wasn't the polite kind of applause. It was pure, loud cheering. These were people who had watched her grow. They had witnessed every era of Miley's life. And no matter what they had thought, they cared. "Miley, welcome back," Whoopi Goldberg said warmly, once the cheering had calmed. "Congratulations again on the Grammys, on the album, on everything that's been happening. You've had such a huge year." "Thank you, Whoopi," Miley smiled. "It's been a crazy one, but in a good way. Like, my whole life's been a bit crazy, but this is a crazy that I actually really like. I can finally enjoy it." The conversation started off easy. Joy Behar asked about the music, the process, collaborating with artists she admired, even her godmother Dolly Parton. Miley answered like Miley always did. Candid, relaxed, and a bit playful. She talked about working late, the pressure of expectation, and the journey to discover who she was in the aftermath of it all. It felt normal. Almost. Routine. But as we were settling in, something was missing. Sunny Hostin. She had been quiet. Too quiet. She sat with perfect posture, her face unreadable. A pen tapped against her notebook, a rhythmic countdown. Waiting, preparing, then. "Miley," Sunny said, "I want to ask you something." Immediately, the room felt different. The air shifted. You could feel it. "You've talked a lot about your transitions," Sunny continued, her voice steady. "From Hannah Montana to the Bangers era to now. How much of that, Miley, was growth? And how much was calculated?" Not an attack, not really soft, sharp, direct. Suddenly, it wasn't just an interview anymore. Miley kept her smile, but something in her eyes changed. "I think growth always involves intention," she replied carefully. "You consider where you want to go and you aim for it, but the changes themselves, they were real. They were born out of places I was really in." "Real places?" Sunny repeated. "So that VMA performance with Robin Thicke, the foam finger, the twerking, that was all a real expression of emotion? It wasn't just calculated shock value to break away from the Disney image? A pause. A split second that lasted forever. It was both." Miley answered, her voice gaining a new edge. "I was trying to get out of a world that felt like it was stifling me, and yeah, I knew that would get attention. They aren't mutually exclusive." But Sunny wasn't finished. "You have to admit, though," she continued, leaning forward, "there was concern. In that phase, you embraced hip-hop culture, the Black American aesthetics, the twerking. And once it was over, you seemed to shed it without explanation. Many people interpreted that as appropriation." And just like that, the conversation turned a corner. So now the real question is, what happens when Miley Cyrus isn't telling her story anymore, but defending it? The statement hung in the air. In that single moment, Miley's composure cracked. Surprise, defense, something else, harder to define. "I've said this so many times, Sunny, more than once. I was a kid, and I was experimenting with my music, with myself, with who I was. And look, I know now I should have handled some of it better, but reducing my entire creative phase in my late teens to simply appropriation is not fair. I was creating music with people I adored. Sonny pressed. Artists you adored. Until you didn't need them anymore? She countered, her tone precise. Once the shock value faded, you moved on. To the Malibu era, to the country era, to the rock era. It always seems to be the exact image that will get you the most attention. The air grew thick with tension. Sarah Haynes shifted uncomfortably. Sonny, artists always evolve. I'm asking a question. Sonny interrupted, not turning. Miley is someone who's been outspoken about her honesty, and that's why we love her. So let's be honest. Were these shifts calculated, or was this real growth? Silence. The studio went quiet. Miley took a slow breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, but held a new power. You want me to tell you I'm calculated? Fine, I am. A pause. I think about my career. I think about my image. I think about the statement I want to make and how I want to make it. That doesn't mean my feelings are fake. It doesn't mean my pain or my struggle or my journey wasn't real. Sonny leaned forward. What struggle, Miley? The question was sharp, almost surgical. Because the reality is, from most people's point of view, you've had an incredibly privileged life. You were born into fame, landed a Disney show at 11 years old. You've never had to truly struggle. And in that moment, something inside Miley shifted. You could see it in the clenching of her jaw. Never struggled? She repeated, her voice starting to rise. You want to talk about struggle? Let's talk about struggle. Suddenly, emotion poured out of her. Let's talk about being an 11-year-old girl working 14-hour days while all my friends were having slumber parties. Let's talk about having my childhood documented, judged, and critiqued by millions of people who had no idea what was actually happening. Let's talk about becoming a product before I even understood what a product was. She leaned in, her eyes fixed on Sonny's. I was Hannah Montana. Do you know what that means? A beat. It means I wasn't just a person. I was a brand. I was a franchise. I had lunchboxes with my face on them before I had my first kiss. I had dolls made in my image before I even knew who I was. My entire identity belonged to a corporation. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. And my own father was a part of that system. Another pause, heavier this time. I love my father. I always will. But he was also my co-star, a part of that machine, someone whose entire livelihood depended on me. Do you know what it's like to be a child and not know if your father is hugging you because he loves you or because you just landed a new contract? Her voice sped up. To watch your family's success and stability fluctuate based on your popularity? I'm not saying my father didn't love me, he did. He does. But the business got tangled up in everything. It blurred the lines that should have been clear. Dinner became meetings. Every moment felt like a transaction. The studio was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Just Miley's voice echoing in the room. So yes, she said, taking a shaky breath. I rebelled. I shocked people because I had to prove to myself that I was more than that character, that I was a real person with choices. She held the silence for a moment. If that appears strategic to you, well, you've never had your identity stolen from you before you've even reached driving age. Sonny did not back down. Child stardom is certainly difficult, Miley, she acknowledged, her tone still measured. But you've also been extremely well compensated. You've amassed immense wealth. Doesn't that level of privilege come with a certain responsibility to consider the impact of how you present yourself to the public? Miley let out a dry, humorless laugh. Responsibility? She echoed. You want to talk about responsibility? I was responsible for an entire production. Hundreds of people depending on me every single day. I was responsible for maintaining an image that sold merchandise in tours and movies. I was responsible for being a role model to millions of children. She paused. While I was still a child myself. Her voice cracked again. Do you know what happens when you put that kind of weight on a child? They break. No one talks about that part. Kids turn to drugs. Some of them disappear entirely. I chose a different path. I broke, but I broke out. I broke loudly, on my own terms. Because if I was going to fall apart, I was going to do it on my own terms. The tension in the studio was unbearable. But Sonny had one last question. And what about the effect you had, she asked, on young fans and the parents who had to explain to their children why their role model was using drugs or doing explicit performances? Miley's response was immediate. That's for parents to parent their own children to do, she snapped back, a beat. I never signed up to raise anyone else's children. I signed up to play a character on a TV show, Miley continued, her voice firm. If people mistook me for that character, then that wasn't something I engineered. That's something they chose to believe. That's an easy way to deflect responsibility. Sunny replied coolly. You profited immensely from the adoration of these young children, and when their well-being became a factor, suddenly it wasn't your job. That was it. Miley stood up. The abrupt movement sent a ripple of anticipation through the room. You want to talk about responsibility? She said, her voice rising. Let's talk about responsibility. She started pacing, unable to contain the energy bubbling inside her. I've always taken responsibility for my actions. I've spoken about them, explained my choices, acknowledged my mistakes, and learned from them. I've been more transparent about my struggles than any other artist in this industry, and somehow it's still not enough. She stopped and pointed directly at Sunny. You're sitting there, playing prosecutor, with a tone that suggests I'm something to be exposed and proved wrong. But what do you want? An apology for not having the breakdown everyone expected? An apology for surviving? I want you to acknowledge that your actions have consequences, Sunny stated calmly. That's what adults do. Adults? Miley let out a harsh, cynical laugh. I've been living like an adult since I was 11, paying taxes, supporting my family, making life-altering decisions for hundreds of people. Don't preach adulthood to me. She turned back to face Sunny. The studio held its breath. You want to know what responsibility means? She asked, her voice softening, growing more raw. It doesn't mean pleasing the critics. It doesn't mean putting on a show of guilt for an audience. It means knowing yourself, knowing who you are trying to become. It means doing the work to repair what you can and forgiving yourself for what you can't. It means waking up and trying to be a better version of yourself than you were yesterday. Her voice turned almost vulnerable. I've spent years in therapy. I've worked through addiction. I've worked through issues of identity, of trauma, from being thrust into the spotlight as a child. I've built genuine relationships. People who know me who I was before any of this, and who will still be there after it all fades away. She put a hand over her heart. That's my responsibility. That's my growth. And I don't need your approval for it. Sunny did not waver. That sounds very powerful, Miley. But is it possible that your current success, the Grammys, the acclaim, is another transformation? The wild child becoming the serious artist? Isn't that exactly what audiences are looking for right now? A trap? A test? Miley paused, then quietly, yes, she said. It is a transformation. And yes, it's what people are looking for right now. A beat. But do you know why? She looked up at Sunny, her eyes steady. Because I finally became who I was always meant to be. That timing, it's not strategy, it's healing. The room went still. I spent my entire life trying to get away from myself, she continued, her voice still calm, but with a quiet intensity. And I finally stopped. She sat back down, but the power in her eyes remained. You want to know the real story? Here it is. Another breath. I lost my home to the Malibu fire. Everything. Awards, memories, pieces of my life. All gone. Her voice trembled slightly as she continued, but instead of feeling completely devastated, I felt freed. Because for the first time, I realized none of it mattered. I was still there. I was still standing. I was still able to create something new. Her eyes watered, but she didn't cry. That fire burned away all of the things I thought made me Miley Cyrus. And all that was left was just me. Not a brand, not an image, not a performance, just a person. She swallowed hard. A person who survived her childhood, her fame, her mistakes, and is still here. A fragile moment hung in the air. Then she spoke again. And after that, my marriage ended. Publicly, hurtfully, and suddenly everyone had something to say. Everyone had an opinion on why. No one knew what happened behind closed doors. Her voice tightened again. No one knew about the compromises I made, the person I tried to become for someone else, the parts of myself I buried so I could hold on to something I thought I loved. She brushed a tear from her eye. And so I wrote Flowers. Not because I wanted to make a point. Not for revenge. I wrote it to survive. Her voice steadied. I needed to remind myself that I could love myself, even when someone else didn't love me back. That I didn't need another person's approval to feel whole. Another breath. Somehow, that authenticity resonated with millions of people who felt exactly the same way. She looked directly at Sunny. That's not manipulation. That's truth. Reaching people exactly when they need it. She spoke with a quiet certainty. You've been working all this time to prove that I'm fake. That my growth is strategic. That none of this is real. But what you're missing is this. A pause. Strategy and sincerity are not mutually exclusive. Her voice was firm, calm. I can be strategic about my career and feel everything with my whole heart. I can plan my path and still be completely authentic. Both things can exist together in anyone who has achieved anything, Sunny started to say, but Miley raised her hand. I'm not finished. The interruption was quiet but definitive. You've come at me today with questions designed to dissect me. Miley continued, her voice steady but sharp, with a tone that assumes the worst, like I'm something to be exposed or a puzzle to be solved. But what you've actually exposed is something about yourself. The studio went silent. You've shown us how hard it is for you to believe that people can actually change, that growth can be real, that success doesn't have to come from manipulation, and that, really, she finished, says far more about you than it does about me. She stood up again, this time without a moment of hesitation, without a hint of doubt. This was her exit. I just want to say one thing, she said, turning slightly away from Sunny to the viewers at home. To everyone who grew up with me, to everyone who watched me stumble and pick myself back up, and to anyone out there right now undergoing their own transition. Her voice gained strength. You don't owe anyone an apology for changing. You don't have to justify your growth to people who have already made up their minds about who you are. You don't have to stay the same person just to make other people comfortable. Change is not betrayal. Growth is not manipulation. And anyone who makes you feel guilty for becoming a better version of yourself, she said with conviction, is only revealing their own limitations, not yours. The silence in the room was palpable, unshakable. Dolly Parton told me something that I'll never forget, Miley said with a slight, knowing smile. She said, find out who you are and do it on purpose. That's what I've been doing my whole life, trying to find myself, sometimes loudly, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes in ways that might have made people uncomfortable, but always, honestly, always intentionally, always me. She adjusted her vintage t-shirt with a small, almost unconscious gesture of self-soothing. Thank you for having me, she added, her tone now almost conversational. I really wish that could have been a conversation about music, about growth, about healing. Instead, it felt like an interrogation, and that's not on me. And with that, Miley Cyrus walked off the set. No music, no cheering, just silence. A silence that lingered, the kind that lets you know you've just witnessed something significant. For a moment, no one spoke. Sunny Hostin sat, still in her usual composed posture, but her gaze fell from Miley's retreating figure to her notes. She had clearly come prepared to dissect a carefully crafted narrative. Instead, she had been confronted by something much more complex, a person who had endured scrutiny and expectation that no amount of success could erase. Whoopi Goldberg slowly shook her head, seemingly still processing it all. Joy Behar seemed to have a million things she wanted to say but couldn't find the right ones. Sarah Haynes discreetly dabbed her eyes. And Sunny? She stared at her notes as if she had asked all the right questions, but had finally realized she no longer knew what the answers meant. But the story doesn't end here. What happened next? The fallout, the argument, the opinions. Sunny would be scrutinized, questions of professionalism would be raised. She would defend herself, claiming she was simply doing her job by asking hard, necessary questions. But one clip would become iconic. Miley walking away from the desk. And in some cases, actions truly speak louder than words. Then came a voice that carried its own undeniable weight. Dolly Parton, a simple tweet that rippled through the internet. My goddaughter, she's been through so much more than people know, and she's still standing, still singing, still being Miley. I couldn't be prouder. And Miley? She continued doing what she always did, making music, speaking her truth, evolving. Not because it was always a calculated move, but because for someone who had been turned into a product before she had even had the chance to be a person, this was survival. Perhaps that's the real story. Not the characters she played or the controversies that followed, but a woman spending her entire life learning who she is and choosing every single day to live it out loud. So now, what do you think? Was Sunny out of line or simply doing her job? Let me know your opinions in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this don't just entertain us, they make us think.